Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today I'd like to talk about some data about VEGA from testing, and well, just basically this is the the big long VEGA ramble number 2. So we're gonna do a follow-up to sort of the last video. So in the last video, I went over a few things about sort of how VEGA 56 could be extremely close to VEGA 64 in terms of performance, depending on how AMD configures VEGA 56 and if we have access to BIOS modding tools and that kind of like BIOS modifications and that kind of thing. And so I hit the nail on the head, didn't I? VEGA 56 and VEGA 64, and actually all the VEGA cards are completely BIOS modding locked. You cannot flash you can flash a custom BIOS onto them. They just won't post on you because AMD has a security coprocessor, and that coprocessor basically goes, oh, this isn't a... I'm not actually sure what level of, like, how legit the BIOS has to be. I don't have enough cards to check that out right now. But basically, it won't let you post if you modify, like, what I basically did was I just modified the version string of the BIOS, which... that's like the simplest mod you can do. There's no real risk to it. It's the same every single, like, you can actually, like, it's human legible, that data is. So I tried that, and right off the bat, the cards refuse to post if you do anything as much as that. And basically, it's a case of the security coprocessor checks the BIOS, realizes it's not the right BIOS, and stops you. I'm not sure if it is possible to take a liquid-cooled VEGA BIOS and put it onto a air-cooled card. I am not sure if you can take a 64 BIOS, put it on a 56, or a 56 BIOS, put it on a 64. You can take a Fury BIOS and put it on a Fury X. So, you know, that sort of... it's not that you'd want to do that. I'm just like, it's sort of a interesting thing to check out, like, what level of... how heavily guarded are the BIOSes is basically what I want to find out. And the interesting thing is, so I tried the VEGA 56 BIOS on the Frontier Edition. That didn't work, but the problem there is the Frontier Edition has 16 gigs of HBM2, whereas the 56 has 8. So I'm not sure if that is the security coprocessor complaining, or if that's just, oh, there's an incompatibility between the 16 gigs of HBM2 and the 8 gig HBM2 BIOS. Now, I don't think there is, but I can't be sure unless I use like a VEGA 56 BIOS on a 64 or a 64 liquid cooled on a regular 64. So, yeah, basically right now, I'm not sure, like, you definitely can't flash a custom BIOS. I'm not sure if you can take a high-power VEGA BIOS and put it on other VEGA cards. I don't think so right now, but again, needs more testing. Now, for Linux users and for miners, you're actually not completely, like, you're actually sort of fine because some user at overclock.net figured out how to basically get a modified Linux kernel to load a custom BIOS onto the GPU right after the security coprocessor does its thing. So basically you boot on the official BIOS and then you load up a custom BIOS on top of that. I'm not sure about the details of how it works, but it does apparently work. For Windows, there is no version of this. For Windows, there is, however, the option to use custom power play tables in the registry. So I have and this is thanks to, again, another user from overclock.net, this time Helm, and he's gone ahead, and I'm not sure about the details of how this works. I'm gonna look into it more, but for now, you know, I'm just using his stuff. So huge thanks to the guy for actually providing the power play tables for the registry for the Frontier Edition and now the 56 as well. So because I did post the VEGA 56 BIOS to overclock.net. So he went ahead and made a power play table for that card as well. So with that, I've managed to test my card on power limits as high as 510 watts. I gave a modified VEGA 56 power play table to Steve at Gamers Nexus. The modifications I did for him are basically, he has a 350 amp current limit. Normally you have a 300 amp current limit. I am not sure if that current limit scales with the power percentage. I don't think it does, because AMD has that 300 amp current limit on both the Frontier Edition BIOS and the VEGA 56 BIOS. I've not seen a 64 BIOS yet. Just nobody, like, The way to extract VEGA BIOSes is to use ATI Flash 2.7.7 and run it in command line mode. That has worked for me and Steve from Gamers Nexus just fine. We've managed to pull BIOSes from cards and then put those BIOSes back on the cards, and the cards work. So it's pulling everything you need for the card to function, evidently. I think it's pulling the full BIOS. We're not 100% sure. I heard a report that somebody's having issues with pulling the full BIOS. I haven't noticed any problems yet, so I think if you run it in command line mode, it just works. So we have tested that, and it is possible to flash. So I've pulled the sort of BIOSes with ADI Flash, and we do have registries, and those work just fine. Though interestingly enough, like, I've not run a high current limit registry for my card yet. So I've used a 300 amp, 255 watt plus 100% power limit. What I gave Steve is 350 amp current limit and 242% power limit, which is really, like, the reason why I gave him a 242% power limit is because I did not want to modify his base power limit for the VEGA 56. VEGA 56 base power limit is 165 watts for the GPU core. I will not talk about why that power limit is so low right now in this video. I will do another video about the differences between NVIDIA and AMD power measuring sometime in the future. We all know how that goes. No idea when that's going to be, so you better subscribe or you're never going to see it, because it's probably not going to be up tomorrow anyway. I have other content on sort of planned. But yeah, so the VEGA 56 has a 165 watt limit in the BIOS or the power play table, in both, basically, because you copy the power play table out of the BIOS. But the VEGA Frontier Edition and I think the VEGA 64 should both have a 220 watt BIOS power limit. So basically I was like, okay, so I want him to have access to something like 400 watts power limit, because in my testing, I did testing for power limit scaling. So I clocked the card to 1680 megahertz core clock with 1050 megahertz HBM, and then I tested it from plus 0% to plus 100% with a 255 watt base. So this is actually already something like 13 or 14% higher than what VEGA normally comes with. Anyway, so I've actually translated all the power limits into like equivalent wattage, so you can actually compare it against the 220 watt BIOS. But anyway, let's go through this. So on 255 watts plus 0%, 1680, 1050 with 1.225 volts, the card scores about 7,000 points in Time Spy. That's just for the graphics test. At 288 watts equivalent power limit, so that's plus 13% on the 255. It's 7,241 points. On 320 watts, or about plus 25%, it is 7,481 points. And 352 watts, it starts leveling off at this point. 7,610 points. And then for 382 watts, 446 watts, and 510 watts, you get 7,630, 7,609, 7,617. That's all margin of error for Time Spy. So basically, from 352 watts equivalent power limit up, the score stops increasing. So that's pretty cool. Now, if you're running a stock VEGA Frontier Edition BIOS, your power limit, like equivalent to what I was able to set, would max out at 220 watts plus 50%, 330 watts equivalent, which if you also compare that against the input power draw, at that point the cards pull about 375 watts through the 8 pins, and that, if you just do a efficiency calculation, is about 88% VRM efficiency, so that makes perfect sense. Because the funny thing about the AMD power limit here, it's VRM output power. It is not input power. It doesn't care about how much power is going into the card. It cares about how much power is coming out of the VRM. So, yeah, that's just a note. That's why the power limit is so low. Like, why you measure way more power going down the 8 pins than you actually set as power limit in the BIOS. So, Yeah, and it does show that the AMD VRM is like the Vega VRM is really efficient. I mean, on stock settings, you're looking at about 91% VRM efficiency, which is like, I think the maximum you can do is something like 93. I don't like, basically anything over 90 is pretty damn high, and I think 95% efficiency is just the hard limit. I don't think there's many power stages that actually approach 95%. So you also have to factor in like capacitor and inductor losses. And if you consider that you can't actually buy a 95 watt power, 95% efficient power stage, basically getting 91% efficiency on a VRM is really, really damn good. So good job AMD with that. Yeah, Vega VRM, it's really nice. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I like this VRM is really like, it fits the card basically perfectly. So, yeah. But anyway, it does look like you're best off if you can set up about a 360 watt power limit. So I gave Steve that BIOS so that he can actually test all the way to 400 watts, so he can go well past where I saw the performance level off. So yeah, he should be able to sort of run an unlimited power. Like, he shouldn't be power limited under any scenarios, which is why I gave him the BIOS I gave him. Because that one is set up for 400 watts output, and it does have that 350 amp current limit, because I suspect that in my testing, what happened towards the end of it was I was actually hitting the VRM output current limitation and not power limit. Like, it wasn't like the performance levels off, and I think that was the current limit kicking in, because that is only 300 amps. And if you do the basic math, 1.2 volts times 300 is 360. So I was at 352 watts, and the performance started leveling off at around 352 watts. So I'm like, okay, it might be the current limit kicking in at that point. I still need to do testing on that. So yeah, that's a thing. Now let's move on to sort of Hbm performance scaling. So I did test Hbm performance scaling. I tested from 800 megahertz all the way up to 1100 megahertz Hbm with 1600 megahertz core clock. I also tested, yeah. And the end result is that the card, like, basically your Hbm performance improvement per clock is about sort of, well, it's really weird. It goes up and down. I think there's some kind of timing strap thing. I'm tried looking into the BIOS a bit for that, but I've not had much success with finding HBM2 timing straps. Again, I am not very good at BIOS modding. I'm just barely good enough to get around, and that's about, like, that's kind of where I stopped caring about BIOS modding, so yeah. Anyway, so basically clocking from 800 megahertz all the way to 1100 megahertz, the average sort of performance increase is about, like, well, not really. It's just, you see sort of about 0.3% per percent. So for every 3% increase in HBM2 clock, you get about 1% performance increase, which really isn't that bad. Sometimes this drops down to 4% per 1% performance increase. But overall, basically, if you increase HBM clock by, say, 15%, which on the 1.35 volt cards is doable, because you're going from 945 all the way to like 1100. A lot of these cards will go all the way to like 1100, especially if you put them under water cooling or something. You should have no issues hitting 1100. You're going to be aiming for about below 60 degrees core temperature. And the HBM2 does actually have temperature sensors. I've just not looked into checking those out right now. So yeah, but around, if you're sort of below 60 degrees core clock, you should be perfectly capable of hitting 1100. My card is not super consistent about doing 1100 HBM. It can do 1050 99% of the time. Well, 100% of the time. 1100 has some sort of thermal issues. So yeah, but you know, you can definitely get like 10% or 10% or 15% memory clock increase on the 1.35 volt cards, and in that situation you're looking at sort of 3 to 5% extra performance for free. And I literally mean for free. There's no power increase on the HBM rail when you do this. So I've actually managed to go and check the Hbm Power Draw, as in how much power the VRM that produces the HBM voltage, which produces that 1.35 volts for the HBM, that VRM pulls about 20 watts. Peak. Like, I've never seen it go above 20. Actually, I've not seen it hit 20 either. I've seen it around 19 watts, approaching 20, and I'm just rounding up to account for any potential error that there might be. And yeah, HBM2 is just ridiculously power efficient. Overclocked to 1050 megahertz, it still pulls under 20 watts. At stock, it pulls under 20 watts. It just doesn't use a lot of power. So yeah, max your HBM clock. Just always max your HBM clock, because that's definitely going to be 3 to 5, maybe even more, like 3 to 5% free performance, literally. Like, you're picking up performance there for free. Now, if you're using a VEGA 56, which they currently aren't available, but if you are considering a VEGA 56, you should know that VEGA 56 has a low HBM operating voltage. My Frontier Edition, I've measured at 1.35 volts VRM output voltage for the HBM2. I asked Steve to measure his VEGA 56. He told me he's measuring about 1.3 volts on the HBM. I'm not sure that he did, like... Here's the thing. I'm 99% sure he measured that correctly. So, I'd always prefer to take the measurement myself, but I'll just trust him on this one. But he did measure 1.3 volts, and that also does kind of explain why his VEGA 56 is basically incapable of going in excess of 1 gigahertz HBM. So you lose about 50 to maybe 100 megahertz over a 1.35 volt card. So VEGA 56 does have a memory clock speed disadvantage over VEGA 64, even overclocked, because it does seem to ship at lower HBM2 voltage. There is no way to get around this. The registry, the PowerPlay registry table thing only works for power limits and, well, current limits, really. So you can't play with voltages in it. I'm not sure yet, but as far as I can tell right now, you can't play with voltages inside it. So... yeah, if you buy a VEGA 56, you shouldn't expect to go over a gigahertz on the HBM. I'm not sure what voltage a VEGA 64 runs. I don't have a VEGA 64. I don't have a VEGA 56. I can't check. And, you know, most, like, no sites, literally no sites, go and use a stab a card with a multimeter, except, like, me, and then I can get Steve to stab his cards. But, yeah, it's not very easy for me to get... information on operating voltages on cards because of that. So I'm going to say, yeah, VEGA 56 does have some intentional disadvantages. You can fix the power limit using the registry thing, so that's pretty cool. In terms of performance scaling from core clock overclocking, the overclock margin for the core clock is worse than what you can do on the HBM. Like, HBM, you can easily push 10 to even 15%. Overclocks on the... Actually, even on VEGA 56, you're doing a 10 to 15% overclock. And the reason for that is VEGA 56 comes at 800 megahertz. So if you hit 950, which is what Steve managed, then that's still an 18.75% HBM clock performance increase. So you can get a good gain in terms of performance over stock. You're just not going to be really able to catch up to a VEGA 64. Now, if you're looking at core clock overclocking on the Frontier Edition, I don't have any of the, like, I watched some of Steve's live stream with VEGA 56, and he was having massive issues just getting the clocks to stabilize, which I'm not sure if that's restricted to the RX VEGA, or if that was because he would, like, this was before I gave him the modded registry for the ridiculously high power limit. I'm not sure if the registry will fix that issue for him, but on my side with the Frontier Edition, as soon as I raise the power limit high enough, the clock just flatlines. So I don't have an issue with this. And I tested basically flat clocks from 900 megahertz all the way to 1650 megahertz. And so if you're testing at 1 gigahertz memory clock, the card actually ends up a bit bottlenecked. The scaling starts to drop off pretty quickly, and basically by going from 1600 to 1650 core clock at 1 gigahertz HBM clock, we're looking at about 0.6% performance increase per 1% core clock increase. So if you overclock your core by 10%, which you can't do, it's really not doable, that would be like a 1760 core clock. I think on water cooling with a lot of voltage, some VEGA cards will do that. So far, I've not, like, my card definitely doesn't do it. Steve's card doesn't do it. Yeah, But if you do manage to do like a 10% core clock increase, you should be seeing about 6% performance improvement if you're at 1 gigahertz HBM clock. And actually, it'll taper off further. So I was seeing like going from 1500 to 1600, it would have been like 6.3% for a 10% clock increase. So basically, the performance scaling with core clock starts to drop off at 1 gigahertz very sharply, sort of past 1600. Now, if you clock the HBM up to 1050, it actually improves it improves the performance level for a longer period of time. You stay up at 0.68% scaling, going from 0.68 instead of 0.6, going from 1600 to 1650, to 1650. So the card definitely starts to run into a memory bottleneck as you raise the core clock. So again, max that HBM. It does nothing for your power consumption, and it improves core clock scaling. It improves performance directly on its own. So definitely worth maxing out the HBM. At 1100, I did manage to test 1100 with liquid nitrogen. So the problem with running 1100 for me is that it really is very temperature sensitive. So I wasn't able to do 1650 at 1100. I wasn't able to test up to 1700. My card can kind of, sort of, maybe sometimes do 1700 core clock. We'll get to some issues with that as well very soon. But I did test 1800 megahertz core clock at 1100 megahertz HBM on liquid nitrogen against 1600 megahertz core clock with 1100 megahertz HBM on air cooling. And the performance difference between those two is actually, yeah, the scaling is really good. So the scaling stays up at around, like, the scaling going from 1600 to 1800 is 0.69% per percent. So basically, if we do the math here, for that, well, actually, it's easier to just put it this way. I got 8194. Should have done these calculations ahead of time, shouldn't I? But I can't keep track of what I want to say until I try to say it, so that's why I have the data sheet open. Anyway, yeah, so I got about 8.6% performance increase going from 1600 to 1800, and that was, that's a clock increase for the GPU core of 12.5%. So again, you're sort of approaching that 7% for 10% core clock increase. So yeah, scaling is definitely not linear, and it does look like if you had enough HBM clock, the scaling would get very close to linear. Because as I was going down the core clock, right, as I lowered the core clock lower and lower and lower, the scaling approaches closer and closer to 1. And again, bumping up that HBM clock speed improved performance scaling a not insignificant amount. So the card definitely is slightly, I'm going to say it's slightly memory bottlenecked. It's not huge because it's like you increase the memory band, like the memory clock speed by 10% and you don't really pick up that much performance, but the core definitely benefits from faster HBM in terms of scaling. So now let's talk about one funny little issue. The card is very temperature sensitive, extremely so. And that caused me a lot of issues when I went over to the very high power limits. So when I was testing 510 watts, one interesting thing I noticed, it is completely impossible for me to run 1700 megahertz core clock at 510 watts with 1.25 volts. Now, I know the card can do 1700 at 1.25 volts. It can't do it with a 500 watt power limit. And the reason for that is the core gets way too damn hot, because that cooler really can't dissipate about 400 watts of heat. I never actually saw 500 watts go down the 8 pins. I think I saw a peak of about 39 amps going down the 8 pins in 3D Mark TimeSpy. Now, TimeSpy is not as power hungry as Firestrike, so that's another thing to keep in mind. And then Firestrike is not as power hungry as 3D Mark 11. So, again, this is not worst case scenario, and I'm already having issues with cooling. So I really think if you want to push VEGA to its absolute limit, and if you want to overvolt, you're going to need water cooling, because these cards just, like, they really hate running above 60 degrees centigrade, because I think that's where it started crashing. Like, I noticed all of my issues with the card in terms of stability is sort of start popping up when Afterburner starts recording peak maximum temperatures of in sort of approaching 60 degrees. So definitely, you know, cooling is going to be a big thing if you want to max these cards out. And yeah, I think it might, like, there's a balancing act with that power limit for that reason if you're on air cooling or some kind of weaker cooling system, where you might not want to run the highest possible power limit if you want to run a high core clock, because it's going to get really hot and then it's going to like drop the clock. So there's a balancing act that you're going to want to mess with. Sort of balance the, I guess what you could do is set up your one step down, because the card's going to downclock as soon as it hits the power limit. So that's the other issue, is like you don't want the card downclocking a ton. So I guess you'd have to configure your DPM 6, so the one step down, so your maximum power clock speed is DPM 7, so you'd want to set up DPM 6 to be very close to maximum, but a lot cooler. So you'd maybe want to undervolt DPM 6 and have very high voltage on DPM 7, so that the card can go to full 1700 plus megahertz in sort of the scenarios where you're not hitting the, where the card isn't running full power, and then throttle down when it goes beyond I think 380 watts, because past that, the cooling is just a nightmare, and temperatures become a real enemy to your clock speed. So that's another thing to keep in mind when overclocking. And then the other issue I noticed, so VEGA has a very interesting bug, the primitive discard, or whatever, the new stuff that they put in VEGA to dump excess geometry. You can glitch it out. It's very easy to glitch out. If you overclock the card too far, it glitches out and it starts discarding stuff that it really shouldn't be discarding. And by that I mean I was testing 3D Mark Time Spy, and I was getting a situation where a lot of the display cases were empty. A good chunk of the crystalline structure in the first graphics test was missing. Some of the floor decoration was missing. Some of the floor wasn't rendering. So a lot of things just started to disappear as you overclock the card really far. The funny thing is that inflates your score. So that's going to be a... It's going to be a bit of an issue for HW bot submissions, because VEGA, like, it's plus, like, I saw an increase in score for that given clock speed of 200 points, because it was discarding stuff it wasn't supposed to be discarding, which I found hilarious. But yeah, it's possible to glitch the card out and it'll start discarding geometry that it should be rendering, which gives it free performance, basically. For gamers, this is just like, you don't need to care about this. For extreme overclockers like me, for anybody trying to be competitive on the HW bot rankings, I'm not sure. Do we like, I guess I'll leave it up to the HW bot moderators whether or not that should be banned. I can't see a way to detect it, because it basically behaves like artifacting. You know, it's like 3D Mark won't give you a warning like, oh, workload was modified. It's basically the driver just skips those like, it just doesn't send that stuff to the geometry to the GPU, and 3D Mark doesn't seem to be able to detect when that happens. So I'm not sure. It might just have to be like, yeah, VEGA scores weird and deal with it, people. Because it does that. And I noticed it. Anyway, another fun little issue with VEGA when overclocking is, ta-da! Anybody notice something really funny about that screenshot? This is not on liquid nitrogen, mind you. This is not on liquid nitrogen. If it was on liquid nitrogen, Afterburner would be showing 0 degrees centigrade. The card does not have cold slow. It does not have a cold bug. I've tested the card with liquid nitrogen all the way down to like minus 185 degrees. The card does not complain, so that's really cool. But no, this is on air cooling. This is actually on the cooling setup you see right behind me. That there, except it was done on the Frontier Edition driver and not the RX driver. On the RX driver, I can't set 2 GHz core clock. The driver, like on the RX driver, I can only set a maximum of 1980, and that is like, at that point the card crashes. But if I set 2 GHz on the Frontier Edition driver, or 2 GHz 80, or basically anything in excess of 2 GHz, it runs. Actually, anything in excess of 1990 megahertz, it'll run. The problem here is, while this clock speed is ridiculously high, the performance at this clock speed is actually worse than stock. It seems to basically be, there seems to be a glitch with VEGA where you can get the clock to display very, very high clock speeds, but the card is actually running closer to stock or slightly under stock. Or actually, no, it would be running like stock instead of like stock with raised power limit. So, yeah, if you see anybody reporting that their card is doing 1900 or 1800 megahertz, it could be this glitch. Because I really needed liquid nitrogen to run 1800. You're not running it on air cooling. Or water cooling. Though I'm not sure if there's a big disparity between RX Vega and Frontier Edition Vega in terms of chip binning. There might be, but I doubt it. I really doubt it. So, you know, if you want me to test that, you can go spam AMD on Twitter about sending me a card or something. I really think I think the clocks are just glitching out. I don't think people are actually hitting 1800 megahertz. And if they are hitting 1800 megahertz, they should also be hitting about 8,000 plus points in the 3D Mark Time Spy test. So a really good way to check if your card is overclocking properly is to just run a benchmark. If you run a benchmark and the score is higher than stock, then you're overclocking. If the score is lower than stock, the clock speed reporting is broken, okay? And I know this because when I was testing the card on liquid nitrogen, that's when I first noticed this issue. Was on liquid nitrogen, I had the card at 2 gigahertz, and I was like, oh man, this card is scaling with cold so good. I ran Time Spy, and it spat out a score lower than stock, and I'm like, okay, so that's broken. Let's see where this goes away. And at 1800 megahertz, the card runs properly. At 1900 megahertz, my card crashed on both liquid nitrogen and air cooling. At 2 gigahertz, it runs on air cooling, it runs on liquid nitrogen, except it doesn't score properly, so it's really not running 2 gigahertz. And because of that, if anybody is reporting a really high clock speed, ask them to give you a score for 3D Mark Time Spy. They should be scoring about 8,000 points, because on liquid nitrogen, my card with 1800 megahertz core clock and 1100 megahertz memory clock, I was scoring 8,200 points in the graphics test for 3D Mark Time Spy. I do not have a score for any other benchmark, unfortunately. So that's why I'm saying Time Spy, because I didn't test any other benchmarks at the time. I didn't think this would be an issue that I would need to bring up. But I'm bringing this up because I've heard reports that some YouTubers and some users are getting 1900 megahertz and 1800 plus megahertz on these cards, and it's just not possible. If you're not scoring over 8,000 in Time Spy, you're not doing 1800 megahertz. The software is glitching out, because, yeah, it does that. My Frontier Edition doesn't do it on the RX driver because, again, the driver is limited to 1980 megahertz. And as I said, my card does this glitch only from 1990 megahertz up. It doesn't do it below that frequency. But yeah, if you can't run 1700 and you can run 1800, there's a glitch. It's not because the card is overclocking. Like, it's not there's some weird clock hole. It's just the software glitches out past a certain frequency point. So yeah, that is definitely worth keeping in mind when watching reviews and anything like that. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. The sun is deciding to screw up the lighting at this point. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of the overclocking information. I'm gonna share my opinion on the whole BIOS modding thing. I obviously think that the fact that AMD has restricted BIOS modding, I mean disabled it completely for Windows users, really sucks. I really think it really sucks. I literally see it as I've always seen the ability to mod GPU BIOS as a feature, okay? And I really think that AMD, who are currently at a performance disadvantage against NVIDIA, really could benefit from a feature that lets you push the card harder, right? Like, here's the thing. VEGA is slower than the 1080. It's faster than the 1070. VEGA 56 beats the 1070. But VEGA 64 is slower than the 1080 or about equal to the 1080, which is really not a great situation to be in. And if AMD gave us access to BIOS modding for undervolting, which actually really improves efficiency and lets the card boost better, or undervolting, lifting the power limit, and maybe modifying HBM2 memory timings to either try get higher frequency out of the HBM, because that's a interesting glitch. Even under liquid nitrogen, I'm not able to go above 1100 megahertz HBM. I suspect there's a memory timing issue, because I can't think of any other way that could be happening, though it might also be a thermal issue. I'm not sure. I still need to do more testing on liquid nitrogen time, and most importantly, I've not insulated that card. If I had multiple cards, I'd just insulate one, and once I learned everything I needed to, I'd go do the mods on another one, but I have one card, so if I want to do any modifications, I need to do them before I run the card on liquid nitrogen, and I don't know until I run on liquid nitrogen what modifications it desperately needs, and I kind of don't feel like doing everything, but yeah. Anyway, I really think, like, you know, I get why the VEGA 56 would, like, for a business-wise, I completely understand why they'd lock down VEGA 56. I don't know why they'd lock down VEGA 64, VEGA 64 liquid-cooled, VEGA Frontier Edition, VEGA Frontier Edition liquid-cooled. Why these cards have to be locked, I don't get. It's not like you're going to flash a VEGA 72 BIOS onto a VEGA 64 to get extra shaders, because there's not a VEGA 72, right? And then, like, I get, like, the VEGA 56, I get it. You don't want the VEGA 56 eating VEGA 64 sales. But if the VEGA 64 was the only card to offer an unlocked BIOS, I think that would actually be another feature you could advertise VEGA 64 to have, right? And that's the thing, right? It's just, like, I literally just see it as, okay, so there's now one less feature on AMD cards for me to play with. And AMD makes these cards. They can do a lot to implement BIOS modding in a way where it voids your warranty when you do it. Or, like, there's any number of things that AMD could do to make BIOS modding possible and still not, like, harm anything AMD side. Because ultimately, miners can still do the modified Linux kernel to push the custom BIOSes, but everybody on Windows is kind of screwed. And, you know, with VEGA not being stellar performance-wise, I really think having access to the BIOSes so that we can eke out every little bit out, like, because here's the thing, modified memory timings, you could see 5% more performance on the memory. Who doesn't want that? Just, like, that would be literally just another 5% extra FPS in games, and admittedly in mining, it would significantly improve performance as well, but I don't see the argument for no BIOS modifications. I really don't, because for gamers it's free performance, for miners it's free performance, and I think VEGA really needs every little bit of performance it can get. So the fact that we can't modify memory timings, because you can get around the power limits, there's the registry stuff, but the fact that we can't modify the memory timings for Windows systems really sucks in my opinion. Because if you look at, like, other cards like the RX 480, the HD 7970, like every single AMD card, like, ever, if you modify the memory timings, you can get a good, big performance increase. And, yeah, you can't do it on VEGA, which I think is, it's a loss. It's a massive loss. And as I said, this is AMD's card. If they wanted to, they could put a trace or solder pads or something that you have to physically modify in order to enable BIOS modding, right? And then the moment you do that modification, it's warranty void. Like, I don't get it, right? They could implement safe BIOS modding. Hell, AMD could roll out an official AMD certified BIOS modification utility and market that as yet another feature for VEGA. And no, you know, it's like, I just always feel like AMD, like, they try. They really try. They've, like, Wattman is this built-in overclocking utility from AMD. It just so happens that it kind of sucks. And before we had Wattman, we had Overdrive, and it kind of sucked. And, you know, recently AMD broke a lot of the overclocking utilities, like Afterburner and everything. They broke Hbm overclocking on all the Fury cards. And it's just like, I get it. AMD really tried, like, they kind of, it's just, it's a mixed message, you know? It's like, yeah, we support overclocking, and we keep breaking it. We keep freaking breaking it. And so it's just like, you know, I don't get it. You know, it's like, on one hand, you keep pushing these overclocking utilities. On the other hand, a lot of the time, these overclocking utilities have massive issues. They don't work. They cause performance loss. They just, They do silly things like load up 3D, like they load up your really unstable overclock at boot up, so you can't actually get into Windows without reinstalling the drivers, though that is now history for Wattman, as far as I know. Overdrive did that for ages and ages and ages. Early Wattman did that as well. If you put a bad overclock on an early RX 480, you couldn't boot Windows because Wattman would try to apply it right as the operating system starts up, so you couldn't get past the loading screen because AMD drivers put the card all the way to full 3D clocks right as they load up. So yeah, that was fun. Yeah, and it's just like, so it's like, AMD, do you want to support overclocking or do you not want to support overclocking? Because it's just like, you could do a lot more and make it a lot better, and you could actually argue that like AMD has the best overclocking support for GPUs ever. And then there's what we actually have right now, where it's like, it's almost as bad as trying to overclock an NVIDIA card. It's not quite as bad, but it's getting there. At this point, it's really getting there. And I find that just, you know, incredibly saddening. So, yeah, that's it for this video. Sorry for dragging this out for so long, but I had a lot on my mind, so, and I had a lot of data to discuss with you, so thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below with any questions or really anything. And if you would like to support what I do here at Actually Hardcore Overclocking, there is a link down in the description that leads to the Patreon, the shirts, the PayPal, the Junkyard. You can find that. It's all under one link. They're not separate links. You just click one link and it'll take you to a page on the blog, and then there's all the links for all those things there. And yeah, right now on the Junkyard, basically, I'll explain what the Junkyard is. The Junkyard is basically used hardware I've used for actually hardcore overclocking. So the GTX 1070 I own, that's going to be going up very soon. That thing doesn't have software voltage control, as in you need to use the potentiometer on it. But that card will be going up very soon, because I don't want it anymore. So yeah, and I'm not sure what to price it at because it's like, it's really dodgy. It also has no warranty, and it's covered in plasti dip. It's perfect if you want to run dry ice or something. It's really bad if you want to use it for gaming, so, or mining, or anything really, because it has no power limit, and it's just everything is broken on that card. But yeah, so that is it for this video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.